The garage had a particular smell in the mornings. Motor oil and cedar and something metallic that Marcus had never quite been able to identify. A smell that had been there when he first walked the property 15 years ago and had never left. The way certain things about a place announce themselves immediately and then simply become part of what the place is. He had always liked that smell. He would sometimes walk out there on Saturday mornings with his coffee, not to do anything in particular, just to stand in the cool of it and think. The way some men go to fishing holes or back porches or the ends of long driveways. The garage was his thinking place. It had been since the beginning. He had bought the house in October of 2009 during the kind of market that made sellers desperate and buyers careful, and he had been very careful. He was an engineer by training and a project manager by profession, and he approached the purchase the way he approached everything, with documentation, with verification, with a surveyor's report that he had paid for himself rather than relying on the sellers, because he had learned early in his career that the most expensive mistakes are the ones you assume someone else already caught. The surveyor's report had revealed something interesting. The detached garage on the corner lot, a solid two-car structure built in 1987 when the subdivision was first platted, sat 3.2 feet outside the HOA's jurisdictional boundary. Not the property line. The HOA line. The original subdivision plat, drawn by a civil engineer named Harold Fitch, who had since retired to Scottsdale, had placed the community's common area governance boundary mid-driveway, a quirk that had probably seemed inconsequential in 1987 and had apparently never been revisited since. Marcus had noted this in his purchase file. He had laminated the plat map. He had kept the surveyor's report in a manila folder labeled, in his precise block lettering, Garage, Jurisdiction. He had not thought about it much after that, because there had been no reason to. The HOA had never bothered him about the garage. For 15 years, the garage had simply been his garage, and the HOA had simply been the HOA, and the two things had coexisted without friction the way most things in Riverside Estates coexisted. Quietly, predictably, with the low-grade hum of a community that had decided collectively that the rules were the rules and everyone more or less knew what they were. That changed in March. Diane Rothschild had been elected HOA president the previous November in what the community newsletter described as a Barchaton landslide war, which in practical terms meant that 41 of the 87 households had returned their ballots, and Diane had received 33 of those votes. She had run on a platform of what she called Estache Standards Restoration, a phrase that meant different things to different people, but which Diane herself seemed to mean quite literally. She wanted the neighborhood to look a certain way, to operate a certain way, to project a certain image to the outside world, and she intended to use the full institutional weight of the HOA to make that happen. She had spent 22 years in corporate middle management at a regional logistics company, and she had brought with her the particular confidence of someone who has spent 2 decades learning how to make organizations move in the direction she wanted them to move. She was not a cruel woman exactly. That was the thing that made her dangerous. She was a procedural woman. She believed in process the way some people believe in religion, not as a means to an end, but as a virtue in itself. If the process said the HOA had authority, then the HOA had authority. If the process said a garage was part of the community aesthetic, then it was part of the community aesthetic. The investigation that would have told her otherwise was not part of her process, because her process began with certainty and worked backward from there. Marcus first became aware of her in January, when she sent a community-wide email announcing a comprehensive Umbrellas Property Standards audit that would begin in the spring. The email was well written and professionally formatted and contained the phrase "Atolls Community Excellencies" 4 times. Marcus had read it, noted it, and returned to his coffee. The community center renovation began in February. It was a significant project. New roof, new HVAC, expanded meeting room, and it created a parking problem that Diane had apparently been thinking about since before the project broke ground. The contractor's equipment occupied the community center's small parking lot. The overflow had to go somewhere. Diane had, in her methodical way, identified several potential solutions, and Marcus's garage had apparently ranked highly on her list for reasons she had not shared with anyone outside the board. On a Tuesday morning in the second week of March, Marcus walked out to his garage at 7:45 with his coffee and found the door open. He stopped on the driveway. The door was not just open. It was fully raised, the way you raise it when you're parking something inside it. And inside it, occupying both bays with the casual authority of a vehicle that has been parked somewhere many times before, was a white Range Rover with a personalized plate that read RVREST1. Riverside Estates, he would later understand, though in the moment he simply stood there with his coffee going cold in his hand and looked at it. There was no note on the windshield, no note on the garage door, no note anywhere. He went back inside and called the HOA's general number, which rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He left a message that was polite and specific. There was a vehicle in his garage that did not belong to him. He would appreciate a call back at the earliest opportunity. Thank you. Then he drove to work, because he had a 9 o'clock meeting he could not miss, and he spent the drive thinking about the vehicle with the focused, unemotional attention he gave to problems that required solutions. Diane called him back at 11:15. Her tone was the tone of someone delivering information rather than having a conversation. "The HOA has determined," she said, "Abed, that your garage structure represents the most efficient available resource for contractor overflow parking during the renovation period. We'll be using it for approximately 90 days. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That's my garage, Diane." "Mick, it's part of the community property profile," she said. "The board reviewed it at last week's meeting." "And I have the deed," he said. "And a survey. The garage is on my property. It's outside your jurisdiction by several feet, actually. We'll have our attorney review any documentation you want to provide," she said. "In the meantime, the arrangement stands." He asked her calmly to have the vehicle removed by end of day. She said she would pass that along. The vehicle was still there when he came home at 6:15. It was still there the next morning. He photographed it. He photographed the open garage door. He photographed the driveway, the property line markers, the street. He pulled the manila folder from his desk drawer and photographed the plat map, the surveyor's report, the deed. He created a folder on his computer labeled, in the same block lettering he used for everything, Garage, HOA Dispute, and he began to fill it. He went to the police non-emergency line that evening and spoke to a dispatcher who was patient and thorough, and who told him that a report would be filed for vehicle trespassing on private property. The dispatcher asked if he wanted the vehicle towed. Marcus said no. He said he wanted the report. The dispatcher gave him a case number and he wrote it in the folder. He sent Diane an email that night. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph described the situation factually. The second paragraph referenced the deed, the survey, and the police reports by case number. The third paragraph requested, in writing, that the vehicle be removed within 48 hours, and that the HOA provide written documentation of any legal authority it believed it held over the garage structure. He sent it at 9:17 p.m. and received an automated reply informing him that HOA correspondence was reviewed during business hours. He made a copy of the email for the folder. He sat for a while at his kitchen table after that, in the quiet of the house, and thought about what he knew and what Diane did not know, and what the distance between those two things might eventually mean. He was not angry exactly. He was something more precise than angry. He was certain, in the way that people who have done their homework are certain, that the ground beneath Diane Rothschild's confidence was not what she believed it to be. He thought about the plat map, about Harold Fitch's careful lines, drawn in 1987, placing a boundary that no one in this HOA had ever bothered to verify, about the 3.2 feet that separated his garage from their authority, about the 15 years he had known this and said nothing, because there had been nothing to say. He finished his coffee. He washed the mug. He went to bed. In the morning, the Range Rover was still there, gleaming white in the early light, sitting in a space that had never belonged to anyone but him. The letter arrived on a Thursday, not slipped under the door, not left in the mailbox with the grocery circulars and the credit card offers. Hand-delivered, certified, requiring a signature. The kind of delivery designed to communicate that what was inside mattered, that the people who sent it had resources and intention, and the patience to make sure you understood both. Marcus signed for it at 7:43 in the morning, still holding his coffee, and stood in the doorway reading it while the courier walked back to his car. Robert Kellerman, Esquire. The letterhead was clean, conservative, the kind of design that communicated competence without warmth. The firm's name, Kellerman, Briggs & Associates, appeared in a dark serif font above an address in the professional district downtown. The kind of office building with a parking garage and a lobby with marble floors and a receptionist who said, "How may I direct your call?" instead of Bartian's hello. Marcus had driven past buildings like that his whole life. He had never had reason to receive mail from one. Yuri read the letter twice standing in the doorway. Then he went inside, set down his coffee, and read it a third time at the kitchen table. The language was precise. Not aggressive in the way that Diane Rothschild was aggressive. Not personal, not performative. Not designed for an audience. This was a different kind of aggression entirely. This was the aggression of procedure, of formal designation, of institutional weight applied with surgical calm. The letter informed Marcus that the Riverside Estates Homeowners Association, through its legal counsel, disputed his characterization of the detached garage structure at his property address as falling outside HOA jurisdiction. It further informed him that the HOA had determined, based on community records and historical use, added that the structure in question was subject to HOA governance under the original covenants, conditions, and restrictions filed with the county in 1989. It informed him that any attempt to obstruct, interfere with, or prevent HOA authorized use of the structure would constitute a violation of those covenants and would result in fines of $500 per day, retroactive to the date of first notice. It informed him that a lien could and would be placed against his primary residence if fines remained unpaid after 30 days. It informed him, in the final paragraph, that the HOA considered this matter a community resource issue and hoped for his cooperation in resolving it efficiently. It did not mention the deed Marcus had shown Diane. It did not mention the survey. It did not mention the 1987 subdivision plat that Marcus had pulled from the county recorder's office himself, the one with the property line drawn in faded blue ink that placed the eastern boundary of the HOA's jurisdiction exactly 3.2 feet short of the garage's western wall. Robert Kellerman had written 4 paragraphs of precise, confident, legally formatted prose, without once engaging with the single piece of evidence that made every word of it wrong. This was not, Marcus understood, because Kellerman was a bad lawyer. It was because Kellerman had not been asked to investigate. He had been asked to assert. There is a particular kind of institutional confidence that does not come from knowledge. It comes from the assumption that knowledge is unnecessary, that the institution's position is so established, so historically uncontested, so structurally obvious, that investigation would be redundant. The HOA had governed Riverside Estates for 35 years. It had sent letters like this one before. It had placed liens before. It had, in every previous case, encountered resistance that eventually crumbled, because resistance is expensive and exhausting, and most people, when faced with the full weight of an organized institution bearing down on them, make the rational calculation that surrender costs less than fighting. Kellerman had written this letter the way he had written dozens of letters before it. He had written it from the posture of a man who already knew how the story ended. Marcus folded the letter carefully along its original creases and placed it in the manila folder he had started 2 days ago, where the folder already contained photographs of the garage, the door open, the white Range Rover visible inside, the angle of morning light making the whole scene look almost domestic, almost innocent, as if the car had simply wandered in from the cold. It contained the printout of the text message Diane had sent him the previous Tuesday, the one that said the HOA had determined this was the most efficient use of community resources and that the arrangement would remain in place for 90 days. It contained his own response, carefully worded, informing her in writing that the garage was his private property, outside HOA jurisdiction, and that he was requesting immediate removal of the vehicle. It contained her response to that, which was 4 words, "We'll be in touch." Now it contained the letter from Kellerman, Briggs and Associates, but Marcus labeled the folder with a date and a case number he had assigned himself, the kind of organizational habit that came from 15 years of working in logistics management, where documentation was not a precaution, but a discipline. He placed it in the fireproof filing cabinet in his home office, in the drawer where he kept the deed, the original survey from when he'd purchased the property, and the laminated plat map. He had looked at that plat map so many times in the past week that he could close his eyes and see the property line, the faint blue ink, the surveyor's notation in the margin that read Eastern Boundary Terminus, reference parcel, 14B, 1987, subdivision plat, county recorder file, 88-2241. He had not shown Kellerman's letter to anyone yet. He was not ready to. What he did instead was make 3 phone calls. The first was to a licensed surveyor named Paul Okafor, whom he found through a recommendation from a colleague who had dealt with a boundary dispute 2 years earlier. Marcus explained what he needed: a new certified survey of his property, specifically documenting the relationship between the HOA jurisdiction line and the detached garage structure, with reference to the original 1987 plat. Okafor said he could have someone out within the week. Marcus said he would prefer within 2 days and was willing to pay the expedite fee. Okafor said that could be arranged. The second call was to the non-emergency line of the local police department. This call took 11 minutes. Marcus explained calmly and in precise sequence, and that a vehicle belonging to a third party had been placed inside his private garage without his consent and had remained there for 6 days, despite his written request for its removal. He explained that he had documentation establishing his ownership of the structure. He explained that he was not requesting immediate action, but was calling to create an official record of the situation. The officer on the line, a woman who sounded tired in the way that people sound tired when they have been answering calls about neighbor disputes for too many years, took down the information, assigned a case number, and told Marcus that if he wanted an officer to come out and document the situation in person, he could request that as well. Marcus said yes, he would like that. He gave her his address and his availability for the following morning. The third call was to his daughter, Lily, who was 26 and lived in Portland and had her mother's directness and her father's patience in roughly equal measure. He told her what was happening. He told her about Diane, about the letter, about the lien threat. He told her about the plat map and the 3.2 feet and the fact that Kellerman's letter had not mentioned any of it. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Who is Dad? Do they actually not know? Or are they pretending not to know?" Marcus thought about that. He thought about Diane's face when he had shown her the deed, The way she had looked at it without looking at it. The way her eyes had moved across the document without landing on anything. But the way she had said, "We'll have our lawyer review it," in the tone of someone who had already decided the review was a formality. He thought about Kellerman's letter, its 4 paragraphs of confident assertion, its complete absence of engagement with the evidence. "I don't think it matters," he said, finally. "The effect is the same." That was the thing that people misunderstood about institutional overreach. They imagined it required malice. They imagined someone sitting in a room, aware of the truth, choosing to suppress it. Sometimes that happened. But more often, and this was the more insidious version, the institution simply never looked. It operated on the momentum of its own history, on the assumption that what had always been true was still true, and on the confidence that its authority was so self-evident that examining it would be a waste of time. The HOA had governed this neighborhood for 35 years. It had never encountered a property line that limited its reach. It had never needed to check, and so it had not checked, and so it did not know, and so it was proceeding with absolute certainty towards a position that was absolutely wrong. The community email arrived that evening. Marcus read it on his phone while eating dinner alone at the kitchen table. Diane had written it in the warm, regretful tone of a manager announcing a difficult but necessary policy change. She expressed appreciation for the community's patience during the renovation period. She noted that temporary resource arrangements had been made to minimize disruption. She noted, without naming Marcus directly, but with a specificity that made him unmistakable to anyone who knew the neighborhood, that one property owner had raised concerns about the arrangement and that the HOA was working through proper channels to address those concerns while keeping the community's best interests at the center of every decision. She had positioned him, not as a man with a deed and a survey and a legitimate legal claim, as an obstacle, as a man who was making things difficult for children who wanted to use the community center, as a man who was choosing his own preferences over the collective good. His phone buzzed 20 minutes later. A text from Janet, his neighbor of 15 years, the woman who had been at the hospital the night his daughter was born and had brought casseroles for a week after his divorce. The text said, "It's just a garage, Marcus. Why make this a thing?" He set the phone face down on the table. He sat with that for a long time. Then he opened his laptop and began drafting a response to Kellerman's letter. Not an emotional response. Not a defensive one. A precise, documented point-by-point reply that attached the deed, referenced the 1987 plat by county recorder file number, and noted that a new certified survey was currently being conducted and would be provided upon completion. He wrote it in the same register Kellerman had used, formal, procedural, calm. He wrote it as a man who understood that the fight he was in was not a fight about a garage. It was a fight about what happened when institutions stopped looking and started assuming. It was a fight about the cost of certainty. He sent it at 10:47 that night and went to bed. The first thing Marcus did the morning after Kellerman's letter arrived was make coffee. Not because he was calm. He was not calm, but because he understood, in the particular way that careful people understand things, that what he did in the next 72 hours would determine everything that came after. Panic was a luxury he could not afford. Precision was the only currency that mattered now. He sat at the kitchen table with the letter flattened in front of him and read it 3 times. Not for the emotional content. He had absorbed that on the first pass, felt the cold institutional weight of it settle into his chest. But for the structural logic. Kellerman was a competent lawyer. The letter was well constructed. It cited HOA bylaws, referenced community covenants, invoked the language of common area governance, with the practiced fluency of a man who had written this particular letter in various forms, many times before. It was built, Marcus noted, entirely on assertion. There was not a single citation of an actual property record, not one reference to a deed, not one mention of a survey. Kellerman had not looked. He had simply written. That told Marcus everything he needed to know about the foundation he was dealing with. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one with the small combination lock that his daughter had teased him about for years, calling it his spy drawer, and removed the laminated plat map. He set it beside the letter. Then he removed the deed, still in its original manila envelope from the title company. The edges soft with age, but the document itself pristine. There because Marcus had kept it in a fireproof box for 15 years and transferred it to this drawer only when he decided the fireproof box was excessive for a document he might need to reference quickly. He had not known, when he made that decision, how right he would turn out to be. He looked at the two documents side by side. The letter from Kellerman, aggressive and certain and hollow. The deed, quiet and absolute and real. Then he picked up his phone and called a land surveyor. Her name was Patricia Osei, and she came recommended by a colleague at the engineering firm where Marcus had worked for 11 years before his retirement. She was thorough, unhurried, and when Marcus explained the situation over the phone, she went quiet for a moment, in the way that professionals go quiet when they are actually thinking, rather than simply waiting for their turn to speak. "You have the original plat?" she asked. "Laminated copy. I also have the deed Wait. I'll need to pull the county records independently. Whatever I certify has to stand on its own." "Now I know," Marcus said. "That's exactly what I need." She came on a Thursday morning, 2 days after Kellerman's letter, and spent 4 hours on the property with equipment that Marcus did not pretend to understand and did not need to. What he understood was the result. When Patricia finished, she stood at the edge of the driveway, at the precise point where the concrete changed color slightly, an artifact of a repair Marcus had done 6 years ago, and she pointed at the ground. "There," she said. "That's your line, 3.2 feet from the garage's front face, running perpendicular to the street." She looked at him steadily. "Your garage is not on HOA-governed property. It never was. The original subdivision plat from 1987 drew the jurisdiction boundary mid-driveway. It's unusual, but it's unambiguous." Marcus nodded. He had known this. He had always known this. But there is a difference between knowing something and having it certified by a licensed professional, with instruments and documentation, and a signature that carries legal weight. That difference was the entire point. "I'll have the certified map to you within 5 business days," Patricia said. "She 3, if possible," Marcus said. "Not urgently. It just precisely." She looked at him for a moment. 3, she agreed. While he waited, Marcus built the paper trail. This was not a dramatic process. It did not look like anything from the outside. It looked like a retired engineer sitting at a kitchen table with a legal pad, a laptop, and a scanner. It looked like a man doing administrative work on a quiet weekday morning. But what Marcus was actually doing was constructing an architecture, a documented, time-stamped, legally coherent record of every single thing that had happened since the morning he found Diane's Range Rover parked inside his garage. He printed every email. He organized them chronologically and annotated each one with the date, time, and a one-sentence summary of its significance. He photographed the deed from multiple angles in natural light and uploaded the images to 3 separate cloud storage accounts, each with a different password. He photographed the laminated plat map. He photographed the garage doors, the driveway, the Range Rover still sitting inside his garage, like a declaration of ownership by a party that owned nothing. He called the non-emergency line for the county sheriff's department and spoke to a dispatcher who was polite but clearly uncertain about the nature of his complaint. Marcus was patient. He explained, without emotion, that a vehicle belonging to a third party had been placed inside his private garage without his consent, that he had documentation establishing his sole ownership of the property, and that he wished to file a formal report. The dispatcher transferred him to a deputy. The deputy was more engaged. Marcus gave him the deed number, the property address, and Diane's name and vehicle registration, which he had photographed from the Range Rover's plates. The deputy told him a report would be filed. Marcus thanked him, hung up, and wrote down the report number, the deputy's name, and the time of the call. He then wrote a letter to Kellerman. Not an angry letter, not a defensive letter, a precise letter, 3 paragraphs long, written in the measured language of a man who has spent a career producing technical documentation that has to be exactly right, because the alternative is a bridge that fails or a building that falls. The letter stated, without embellishment, that Marcus disputed the HOA's claim to jurisdiction over the garage, that he possessed a deed and a survey establishing his sole ownership of the property in question, that he had filed a police report regarding the unauthorized use of his private property, and that he would be providing full documentation to any legal proceeding the HOA chose to initiate. He did not threaten. He did not demand. He simply stated what was true and what he had done. He sent it certified mail and kept the receipt. Patricia's certified survey arrived in 2 days, not 3. Marcus added it to the file, which by now had grown to 47 pages of organized documentation. He made 3 copies. 1 went into the fireproof box. 1 went into a sealed envelope that he dropped at his attorney's office, not to initiate anything, just to establish a record in a third party's possession. The 3rd copy he kept in the desk drawer, accessible, ready. The HOA's lien notice arrived on a Friday, $45,000, accumulated at $500 per day for the 90-day period they had declared. Marcus read the notice standing at the kitchen counter, still in the clothes he'd worn to the mailbox. He felt something move through him. Not quite anger, not quite fear, but something in the register between them. Something that recognized the weight of what was being done to him. $45,000 was not abstract. It was real. It was the kind of number that could attach itself to a home, could follow a person through a credit report, could complicate a life in ways that took years to unravel. He stood there for a moment. Then he put the notice in the file, in chronological order, up behind the police report, and ahead of the space he had already left for Patricia's certified survey. He understood what the lien was. It was a pressure instrument. It was designed to make compliance feel cheaper than resistance. It was designed to make a man look at a number and decide that the principle wasn't worth it. Diane and Kellerman and the board had deployed it with the confidence of people who had deployed it before and watched people fold. What they did not know, what they had never bothered to find out, was that Marcus had spent 15 years knowing exactly what he owned. He had the deed. He had the survey. He had the plat map from 1987 that drew a line in the earth 3.2 feet from his garage door and said, with the quiet authority of a legal document that predated every one of them, that this was his. The paper trail was not just documentation, it was a foundation. And Marcus had been building foundations his entire professional life. He knew how they worked. He knew that the ones that held were the ones built before the weight came down, not after. He closed the file. He made a second cup of coffee. He sat back down at the kitchen table and began to research flights to Maui. Not yet, but soon. The letter arrived on a Thursday, not slipped under the door, not left in the mailbox with the grocery circulars and the credit card offers. Hand-delivered, certified, requiring Marcus's signature on a green card that the postal carrier held out with the mild, apologetic expression of someone who understood, on some animal level, that they were handing a person a grenade. Marcus signed for it. He brought it inside. He set it on the kitchen table next to his coffee, and looked at it for a moment before he opened it. The way you look at something before you change it. before the act of opening makes the thing inside real in a way it wasn't when it was still sealed. The letterhead read Kellerman, Pruitt and Associates. Below that, in the formal architecture of legal correspondence, was his name and address. Below that, a subject line. Notice of Assessment Lyon, 4417 Ridgecrest Drive. He read it twice. Then he read it a third time. Slowly. The way you read something when you are looking not for what it says, but for what it assumes. What it assumed was everything. The letter informed Marcus Chen that the Riverside Estates Homeowners Association, pursuant to Article 9, Section 4 of the Riverside Estates CC and RS, we had assessed cumulative fines against his property in the amount of $45,500, representing 91 days of non-compliance at $500 per day, plus a $200 administrative processing fee. It further informed him that said fines had been converted, by unanimous vote of the HOA board, into a formal lien against his property at 4417 Ridgecrest Drive. It informed him that the lien had been recorded with the county recorder's office. It informed him that failure to satisfy the lien within 30 days would result in the HOA pursuing all available legal remedies, up to and including foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosure. The word sat in the middle of the page like something dropped from a great height. Marcus put the letter down. He picked up his coffee. He looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, at the Japanese maple he'd planted the year his daughter started kindergarten, at the garden beds his wife had designed before she decided she preferred the apartment in Portland to the suburb in California, at the ordinary, accumulated evidence of 15 years of a life lived in one place. Then he looked past all of that, past the fence line, to the roof line of the detached garage visible above the back fence, and he thought about what Robert Kellerman had not done before writing that letter. Kellerman had not pulled the deed. He had not requested the survey. He had not examined the 1987 subdivision plat that Marcus had laminated and filed in the second drawer of his desk, the one beneath the router and above the hanging files. He had not done the single act of professional due diligence that would have taken him 45 minutes and saved everyone involved an enormous amount of what was coming. He had taken Diane Rothschild's word for it. That was the thing Marcus kept returning to. The thing that made this particular injustice feel so specifically modern, so perfectly characteristic of the way institutions failed. It wasn't malice at the foundation. It was incuriosity. It was the assumption that the person with the title and the letterhead and the unanimous board vote behind them must already know what they're talking about. It was the professional courtesy extended between one institutional actor and another, the handshake of mutual certainty between people who had stopped checking. He opened his laptop. He pulled up the county recorder's website, where he typed in his address. There it was, recorded 2 days ago. Riverside Estates HOA versus Chen, Marcus T. Lyon, amount, $45,700. He sat with that for a moment. His home, the thing he had purchased with 15 years of mortgage payments, the thing he had maintained and insured and paid property taxes on, the thing that was his in the most fundamental legal sense, available to a person in a civil society. His home now had a cloud on its title. Anyone who ran a title search would find it. Any bank he approached for refinancing would find it. Any buyer, if it ever came to that, would find it. The HOA had taken a piece of paper built on a false assumption and used it to reach inside the legal identity of his property and attach something to it. He photographed the letter. He scanned it. He saved it in 3 places. And then he went to the second drawer and took out the laminated plat map. He had looked at this document many times over the 15 years he'd lived here, but he looked at it differently now. He looked at it the way you look at something when you understand it is going to matter, when the abstract fact of a thing becomes the operational fact of a thing, when the survey coordinates stop being numbers on a page and start being the precise dimensions of your defense. The 1987 subdivision plat for Riverside Estates was a dense document, the kind of thing that required a surveyor's eye to read fluently. But Marcus had spent enough time with it to know its critical feature by heart. The HOA's jurisdictional boundary, the line that defined what was common area and what was private property, ran along the eastern edge of the main lot at 4417 Ridgecrest Drive. The detached garage sat to the east of that line, not adjacent to it, not ambiguously near it, east of it by 3.2 feet, according to the certified survey Marcus had commissioned 6 weeks ago from a licensed land surveyor whose stamp and signature appeared on the bottom right corner of the document. The HOA's jurisdiction ended before it reached the garage. It had always ended before it reached the garage. The CC&Rs that Kellerman had cited in his lien letter, Article 9, Section 4, the provision authorizing fines for non-compliance, applied exclusively to properties and structures within the HOA's jurisdictional boundary. The garage was not within that boundary. It had never been within that boundary. The fines were assessed against a structure the HOA had no authority to assess fines against. The lien was recorded against a property claim the HOA had no legal standing to make. Marcus set the plat map on the table next to Kellerman's letter. He looked at both of them. He thought about Janet, who had told him it was just a garage. He thought about the neighbors who crossed the street now when they saw him coming. Not from cruelty, but from the social instinct to avoid a person who had become, in the neighborhood's collective imagination, a problem. He thought about Diane Rothschild's white Range Rover, still sitting in his garage, still occupying the space it had occupied for 91 days, still parked on private property that the HOA had decided, without investigation, without verification, without the basic professional courtesy of reading a deed, was theirs to use. He thought about what $45,000 meant to a person. Not to him specifically. He was not a wealthy man, but he was not a desperate one. But to the abstraction of a person, to the average homeowner in Riverside Estates, who had bought here because the schools were good, and the streets were quiet, and the HOA, for all its aggressive enforcement, gave the neighborhood a certain stability. He thought about what it would mean to that person to receive this letter, to see that number, to feel the weight of institutional certainty pressing down on them from every direction. The lawyer's letterhead, the board's unanimous vote, the lien recorded at the county. In the neighbor's gentle suggestion that it was just a garage, why make this a thing? Most people would pay. Not because they were wrong, but because the machinery of being wrong had been assembled around them so completely and so efficiently that the cost of proving otherwise exceeded the cost of surrender. Marcus was not most people, but he understood why most people were most people, and he felt something adjacent to grief about it. He put the plat map back in the drawer. He put Kellerman's letter in the file he had been building, the file that now contained 47 photographs, 11 email exchanges, 3 certified mail receipts, 1 police report number, 1 license survey, and 1 laminated plat map that was about to become the most important piece of paper in this story. He opened a new browser tab and searched for flights to Maui. He was not running. He understood the distinction clearly, even if no one watching would. He was not retreating. He was not conceding. He was doing something that required a particular kind of confidence, the confidence of a man who knows exactly what he has and is willing to let the people who don't know find out on their own. He found a flight, direct, leaving Saturday morning. He booked it. The welder's name was Arturo Vega, and he arrived at 7 in the morning in a white truck with a magnetic sign on the door that read Vega Fabrication and Structural Welding, licensed, bonded, insured. He was a compact man in his late 40s with forearms that looked like braided rope and a habit of assessing structural problems the way a doctor assesses a patient. Quietly, with his hands, running his fingers along the seams before he said a single word. Marcus had found him through a contractor he trusted, a man who had done the tile work in his kitchen 6 years ago, and who, when Marcus explained what he needed, had paused and said, "I know exactly who you want." Arturo had listened to the full explanation on the phone without interrupting. When Marcus finished, Arturo had said simply, "Bring me the deed. I want to see the property line before I touch anything." That was when Marcus knew he had the right man. They stood together in the driveway now, in the thin, early light, and Arturo studied the garage the way a man studies a contract before signing it. The white Range Rover was still inside, exactly where it had been for 11 weeks. Diane had stopped coming to check on it after the 3rd week, once the HOA's formal lien notice had been delivered, and her lawyer had assured her the matter was proceeding through proper channels. The car had simply become a fixture, a symbol of institutional certainty, sitting on 4 wheels in a space that did not belong to the institution. Arturo crouched and looked at the base of the garage door track. He stood and looked at the hinges. He walked the full perimeter of the structure, and Marcus walked with him, and neither of them spoke until they had completed the circuit. Then Arturo said, "You understand what this does?" Marcus said he did. Arturo said, "Once I seal these, nobody opens them without cutting equipment. That includes you." Marcus said he had a storage unit in Tempe with everything he needed for 3 weeks. He said the garage contained nothing of his. He said the only thing inside was a vehicle that had been parked there without his consent, without his knowledge, and in direct violation of property rights that were documented, certified, and on file with the county recorder's office. Arturo nodded slowly. He was not a man who required drama to understand the weight of a situation. He said, "I'm going to need you to sign a work order that specifies the legal basis. My insurance requires it for any job involving a property dispute." Marcus went inside and came back with a folder. He had prepared it the night before with the same methodical attention he had brought to every step of the previous 11 weeks. Inside the folder was the original deed, the certified survey from the licensed surveyor he had hired in week 2, the laminated plat map from the 1987 subdivision filing, and a 1-page summary he had written himself that described the property line, the 3.2-foot discrepancy, and the HOA's jurisdictional boundary, as recorded in the original Riverside Estates governing documents. He had also included a printed copy of the police report he had filed in week 1, the report number visible at the top, and a chronological log of every written communication between himself and the HOA, beginning with Diane's first verbal declaration and ending with the lien notice. Arturo read through it standing in the driveway. He did not rush. He turned pages with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that paper was the only thing that mattered when everything else was noise. When he finished, he closed the folder and handed it back and said, "All right. I'll draw up the work order to reflect the property documentation. You keep a copy. I keep a copy." He said it the way a man says something that has already been decided. The work itself took 4 hours. Arturo worked with a precision that Marcus found almost meditative to watch. He was not destructive. He was not punitive. He sealed the garage doors along their full perimeter with structural welds that were, by any reasonable assessment, whether professional work, the kind of work you would do if you were securing a structure against weather, or against unauthorized entry, or against the specific category of institutional assumption that had decided, without investigation, that a man's private property was available for community use. Marcus photographed every stage. He had set up a small tripod on the driveway and used his camera on a timer, capturing the work in systematic intervals. The photographs were time-stamped. The work order was time-stamped. He had already called the non-emergency police line the previous evening and informed them that he would be securing his garage the following morning for documented security purposes, and the officer who took the call had logged it and given him a reference number, which Marcus had written at the top of the work order in blue ink. When Arturo finished, he packed his equipment with the same quiet efficiency he had brought to everything else. He handed Marcus a copy of the completed work order and a certificate of the weld specifications, the type of material, the structural rating, the method. Marcus added both documents to the folder. Then Marcus went inside and printed 3 copies of a single-page notice. The notice stated, in plain language, that the structure was sealed private property, that the vehicle inside was on private property without owner consent, that the deed and certified survey establishing ownership were on file with the county recorder and available upon request, and that any attempt to cut, damage, or otherwise breach the sealed structure without the written consent of the property owner would constitute destruction of private property under state statute. He cited the statute number. He had looked it up himself and then had it confirmed by the attorney he had consulted in week 3, a quiet, precise woman named Sandra Okafor, who had read his documentation and said, with a calm that Marcus found deeply reassuring, "They have no case. What they have is a habit of not being challenged." He taped 1 copy of the notice to the garage door. He placed 1 copy in a sealed envelope addressed to the HOA's management office. He drove the 3rd copy to the local police precinct and asked the desk officer to attach it to the existing report file. The officer looked at it, looked at Marcus and said, "You've been busy." Marcus said he had. He drove home and finished packing. The suitcase was already mostly done. He had been assembling it in stages over the previous week, the way he assembled everything, incrementally and without urgency. 3 weeks of clothes, his laptop, the external hard drive that contained digital copies of every document in the folder, organized into dated subfolders, backed up to 2 separate cloud services. His daughter had called the night before from Portland and asked if he was really going through with it, and he had said yes, and she had laughed, not unkindly, but with the specific laugh of someone who has watched a patient person reach the end of their patience and found the sight unexpectedly satisfying. He left the folder on his kitchen table. Not the original. The original was in a fireproof lockbox in his bedroom closet. The folder on the table was a copy, assembled for the neighbor he trusted, a retired engineer named Paul who lived 4 houses down and who had agreed, without being asked for a reason, to keep an eye on things. Paul had looked at the folder when Marcus handed it to him the previous evening and said, "You've documented this like a legal case." Marcus had said that was exactly what it was. The HOA did not know he was leaving. He had not told them. He was not required to tell them. He was a private citizen securing his private property and traveling on his own schedule, and the notion that he owed Diane Rothschild or Robert Kellerman or the Riverside Estates HOA board any advance notice of his personal movements was precisely the kind of institutional assumption that had produced this situation in the first place. He thought about that as he locked his front door, the assumption of authority, the way it operated not through malice exactly, but through the accumulated weight of never having been questioned. Diane had parked in his garage because it had not occurred to her that she couldn't. Kellerman had sent the lien notice because it had not occurred to him to check whether the HOA actually had jurisdiction. The board had voted unanimously because it had not occurred to any of them that the institution they were defending might be operating on a fiction. That was the thing about institutional certainty. It didn't need to be cruel to be dangerous. It just needed to be incurious. Marcus put his suitcase in the car and drove to the airport. He did not look back at the garage as he pulled out of the driveway, but he knew what it looked like. He had photographed it that morning after Arturo left. The sealed doors, the notice taped squarely in the center, the white Range Rover visible through the small side window if you pressed your face close enough to the glass. It looked like a problem that had been handed back to the people who created it. It looked like the moment when a methodical man, having exhausted every reasonable avenue, had decided to let the paperwork do the talking. Somewhere in a filing cabinet in the HOA management office, there was a lien notice with his name on it. There was a cease and desist letter. There were 11 weeks of fines calculated at $500 per day. And somewhere in the county recorder's office, there was a deed, a survey, a plat map from 1987 with a property line that fell exactly 3.2 feet outside the HOA's jurisdiction. The deed had been there the whole time. No one had looked. The phone had been off for 6 days. That was the point. That was the whole point. Marcus had not come to Maui to think about Riverside Estates, or Diane Rothschild, or the particular shade of institutional arrogance that had settled over his neighborhood like a slow fog. He had come because the Pacific Ocean does not care about HOA bylaws, because the trade winds off Kanapali do not carry the smell of certified mail, because there is a specific kind of silence available only to people who have done everything they needed to do and are now simply waiting for the world to catch up with the facts. He had rented a small house in Lahaina, not a resort, not a hotel, but an actual house with a screen door that banged in the wind, and a landlord named Kenji who left fresh papayas on the porch every other morning without explanation or expectation. Marcus had slept 9 hours the first night, 10 the second. He had eaten fish he didn't know the name of at a counter restaurant, where nobody asked him anything. He had sat on the beach in the early mornings, when the light came low and orange across the water, and he had felt, for the first time in 3 months, like a man who existed in his own body, rather than inside a legal dispute. He turned the phone on for the first time on day 7, because he had promised his daughter he would. Lily was 26 and lived in Portland and had inherited her father's particular combination of patience and precision. She had called 4 times. The voicemails were brief and characteristically Lily, each one a single sentence of increasing specificity. The first said only, "Call me when you surface." The second, "Something is happening with the HOA, I've been talking to your neighbor." The third, "Dad, I think you need to call Janet." The fourth, left just 14 hours ago, said, "Dad, Kellerman called me. The HOA's lawyer called me. Please turn on your phone." Marcus sat with that for a moment. He was on the porch. The papayas were there. The screen door was moving in the wind. He could hear the ocean 2 blocks away. Not see it, just hear it. That low, continuous exhalation that sounds like the earth breathing. He called Lily. She answered before the second ring. "Dad." Not a question, not a greeting, just the word carrying everything. "I'm here, Hua," he said. "Menaro Kellerman called me 3 days ago. He said he couldn't reach you and that it was urgent. I told him I wasn't your secretary and he said, She paused, and Marcus could hear her choosing her words the way he had taught her to, deliberately, without heat. He said that the situation had changed significantly and that you should contact him before taking any further action. "I haven't taken any action," Marcus said. "I'm eating papayas." "Dad, I'm serious. They're very good papayas." "As a dad." He sounded scared. Marcus was quiet for a moment. A gecko moved across the porch railing with that particular liquid efficiency that geckos have, as though they are made of something slightly different from other living things. "And tell me what Janet said." Lily exhaled. "She called me 2 days after Kellerman. She said, and I'm quoting her, that the neighborhood has gone insane. She said Diane tried to get someone to cut the welds on the garage, and the guy she called refused when he saw the police notice you left. She said Diane then called the city to report an abandoned vehicle on private property, and the city told her the vehicle wasn't on city property and wasn't their concern. She said Diane then tried to get the HOA board to authorize a locksmith to access the garage from the interior, and the board's vice president, the new one, Hendricks, said he wanted to see the property documentation first. Good for Hendricks. Marcus said. Janet said, Diane told the board that you were a bad actor trying to exploit a technicality. She said Hendricks asked her what the technicality was, specifically, and Diane said she'd have Kellerman explain it. And Kellerman, apparently in the meeting, Dad, he was in the meeting, said he needed more time to review the documentation. Marcus set down his coffee cup. He's seen the deed. Janet thinks so. She said the whole meeting went quiet in a way she'd never seen before. She said Diane kept talking, but nobody was really listening anymore. She said it felt like watching someone give a presentation and slowly realizing the slides are wrong. There was a quality to the silence between them that Marcus recognized as the particular silence of a thing becoming real. He had lived inside the abstract version of this moment for 3 months, had known with the cold certainty of a man who has read his own documents 100 times, that the day would come when someone on the other side actually looked. He had known it intellectually. He had built his entire strategy around it. But knowing a thing and feeling it arrive are different experiences, and sitting on a porch in Lahaina with the ocean breathing 2 blocks away, Marcus felt it arrive. He's seen the deed, Marcus said again. He's seen the survey, and he's seen the 1987 plat map, and he now knows that the HOA has been parking a vehicle in a structure that is not and has never been within their jurisdiction, and that they have fined me $45,000 for objecting to it, and that they have placed a lien on my home, and that all of it, every single letter, every single vote, every single community email Diane sent calling me obstructive, is documented. Yes, Lily said. Warned, and he knows that I have a police report. Yes, Doctor. And he knows that the lien is on record. Dad, Munchie, because a lien on record is a public document, and a public document attached to a property that the HOA demonstrably has no jurisdiction over is not just an error, it's tortious interference, it's potentially slander of title. The silence on the line had a different quality now. Lily was a paralegal. She had been one for 4 years. She understood what those words meant in the way that people understand words that have weight. Kellerman knows all of this, she said. It wasn't a question. Kellerman is a competent man, Marcus said. I never thought he wasn't. I thought he was incurious. I thought he took Diane's version of events and built a legal structure around it without ever checking the foundation. That's not incompetence. That's a very common kind of professional failure. But he's checked the foundation now. He wants to talk to you. I know. Are you going to call him? Marcus looked out at the street. A woman was walking a dog the size of a small sofa. 2 children were arguing about something on a bicycle. The morning light was doing what morning light does in Hawaii, which is to make everything look like it was made specifically to be looked at. Not today, he said. Dad, dear Lily, listen to me. I have done nothing wrong. I have committed no violation. I have a deed, a certified survey, and a laminated plat map that have been accurate for 15 years. I have filed a police report. I have documented every communication. And I have sealed my own private property against unauthorized use, and I have done so with professional documentation and legal notice. I am not in a hurry. The urgency belongs to them. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted. Not softer exactly, but more considered. Janet also said something else. She said some of the neighbors have been talking. She said people are starting to ask questions about the original jurisdiction map. She said someone, she didn't know who, had pulled the 1987 plat from the county records office, and apparently it's been circulating. Marcus felt something move through him that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite vindication, but was in the neighborhood of both. Who pulled it? She doesn't know. But she said once people started looking at it, the questions got louder. She said 3 families on the east side of the development have started wondering whether their own property lines were accurately represented in the HOA's jurisdiction documents. And there it was. That was the thing about a foundation built on assumption rather than investigation. When it cracked, it didn't crack in one place. Marcus had known this too, in the abstract. Had known that his garage was not the only anomaly in a subdivision platted in 1987 and administered for 35 years by people who had never looked at the original document. But knowing it and hearing it described as a present, active, spreading reality were different things. "The HOA is not just looking at my garage," Marcus said. "No," Lily said. "I don't think they are." He thanked her. He told her the papayas were genuinely excellent and that she should visit Kenji's rental sometime. She told him to call Kellerman eventually, not because he owed Kellerman anything, but because letting people sit in their own anxiety too long sometimes made them do unpredictable things. It was good advice. It was the kind of advice he would have given her. He sat on the porch for a long time after he hung up. The gecko was gone. The woman with the enormous dog had turned the corner. The children had resolved their bicycle dispute in whatever way children resolve things, which is to say, completely and without residue. He thought about Diane Rothschild standing in his garage on a Tuesday morning, not looking at the documents he held out to her. He thought about the specific quality of that moment, the way she had said, "We'll have our lawyer review it," with the absolute confidence of someone who has never been wrong because they have never been checked. He thought about Robert Kellerman writing that first letter, aggressive and procedurally precise, built on a foundation of zero investigation. He thought about the board voting unanimously, not because they were malicious, but because institutions in motion tend to stay in motion, and nobody had thought to ask whether the track was real. He thought about Janet telling him it was just a garage. It was never just a garage. It was the moment when someone in authority decides that investigation is unnecessary because certainty is sufficient. It was the moment when a document, a deed, a survey, while a plat map laminated in a desk drawer, becomes either the thing that protects you or the thing that nobody bothers to read. Marcus had spent 15 years knowing what he owned. He had spent 3 months waiting for someone else to find out. The waiting was almost over. He picked up the phone one more time and called his attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had reviewed his documents 2 months ago and told him, in the flat, declarative tone of someone describing weather, that his position was unambiguous and that the HOA's exposure was significant and growing. He left her a voicemail telling her he was available and that she should expect contact from Kellerman's office, and that she should not, under any circumstances, accept anything less than a full lien release, a written retraction of all fines, and a formal acknowledgement that the garage had never been within HOA jurisdiction. Then he put the phone in his pocket and walked the 2 blocks to the ocean. The water was the color of something that doesn't have a name in the language of landlocked places. He stood at the edge of it for a long time. He was not a man given to dramatic internal monologue. He did not narrate his own emotions. But he stood there long enough that the water came up over his shoes twice, and he didn't move, and that was enough. The call had changed everything. Not because it had told him anything he didn't already know, but because it confirmed the thing that patient people understand, and impatient institutions always forget. The facts do not change. The deed does not change. The survey does not change. The plat map, but laminated in a desk drawer in a house in Riverside Estates, had been accurate on the day Marcus bought it, and was accurate now, and would be accurate when he returned. The only thing that had changed was that the people who had chosen not to look at it had finally looked, and now they knew what he had always known. The ocean came up over his shoes a 3rd time. He let it. Robert Kellerman had been practicing real estate law for 22 years, and in that time he had developed a professional habit that had served him well. He trusted his clients to tell him the truth about what they owned. It was not laziness exactly. It was efficiency. Clients came to him with problems, and problems had context, and contexts were provided by the clients themselves. You built the case from the foundation they gave you, but you didn't go excavating for foundations that weren't supposed to be there. This was the habit that was about to end his firm's relationship with Riverside Estates HOA. He had the deed in front of him now. Not a copy, not a summary. The actual recorded deed, pulled from the county recorder's office that morning by his paralegal, a 26-year-old named Sophia, who had the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that the most dangerous documents were always the ones nobody had bothered to read. Sophia had placed it on his desk without comment. She had also placed beside it the 1987 subdivision plat, the original, certified, surveyor-stamped document that established every property line in Riverside Estates at the moment of its creation. And beside that, she had placed Marcus Chen's certified survey, and the one commissioned 3 weeks ago by a licensed surveyor named David Okafor, whose credentials she had already verified without being asked. Kellerman looked at the 3 documents for a long time before he touched any of them. Then he put on his reading glasses and started with the plat. The 1987 subdivision plat for Riverside Estates was a dense document, the kind that required patience and a working knowledge of surveying notation to interpret correctly. Kellerman had that knowledge. He had reviewed dozens of plats over his career, mostly in the context of boundary disputes between neighbors who couldn't agree on where one lawn ended and another began. Those disputes were usually about inches. They were usually resolved with a handshake and a new fence post. This was not that. The plat showed, with the indifferent precision of a document that had been sitting in a county archive for 37 years, waiting for someone to look at it, that the property line on the eastern corner of Lot 14, Marcus Chen's lot, did not run where the HOA had assumed it ran. The HOA's governing documents, drafted in 1989 when the Community Association was formed, had described the common area boundary using a shorthand reference to the subdivision plat, rather than reproducing the actual coordinates. It was a drafting choice made for convenience. It was the kind of choice that worked perfectly until it didn't. The detached garage on Lot 14 sat 3.2 feet outside the HOA's jurisdictional boundary. Not ambiguously outside, not arguably outside. Mathematically, documentably, recorded in the county archive since 1987 outside. Derek Kellerman set the plat down and picked up Marcus's deed. The deed was clean. It was clear. It described the property with full metes and bounds notation that matched the plat exactly. It had been recorded at the time of purchase 15 years ago. It had a county recorder's stamp. It had a file number. It was, in every legal sense, unimpeachable. He thought about the letter he had sent Marcus Chen 6 weeks ago. The letter that had cited HOA authority over the garage. The letter that had threatened $500 per day in fines. The letter that had warned of a lien against his home. He thought about the lien that had, in fact, been filed. $45,000. Against a man who owned his property outright, whose garage sat outside HOA jurisdiction, as who had tried to show Diane Rothschild his deed on the first day and been told, essentially, that it didn't matter. Kellerman took off his reading glasses and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. Sophia appeared in the doorway. She did not say anything. She had worked for him long enough to know when he needed a moment and when he needed information, and right now he needed both, so she simply held up a second folder. "County Assessor Records," she said. "The garage has been assessed as part of Lot 14 since 1987, separately itemized, taxed to the homeowner every year, including this year." He took the folder. He didn't open it immediately. He already knew what it would say. "Pull the HOA's governing documents, Mashim," he said. "The original 1989 CC&Rs and every amendment since." I want to know if there is a single document in their entire recorded history that references that garage as common area or subject to HOA jurisdiction. I already did, Sophia said. There isn't. The silence in the office was the particular silence of a professional understanding that he had sent an aggressive legal threat on behalf of a client who had no legal standing to make it, that he had helped file a lien against a man whose property rights were not in dispute, that the HOA had not merely overstepped, they had constructed an entire enforcement campaign on a foundation that did not exist, and he had handed them the legal language to do it with. He called Diane Rothschild at 11:17 that morning. She answered on the second ring, which told him she had been waiting for the call. She had probably been waiting for confirmation that the legal machinery was moving forward, that Marcus Chen's resistance was about to be crushed under the weight of formal proceedings. She had the voice of someone who had already written the ending. Kellerman did not let her finish her greeting. Diane, he said, I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to not say anything until I'm finished. He walked her through it. The plat, the deed, the assessor records, the jurisdictional boundary, the 3.2 feet. He used plain language because this was not a moment for legal abstraction. He told her what the HOA had done, what he had done on the HOA's behalf, and what the legal exposure looked like from where he was sitting. The exposure was significant. Tortious interference with property rights, wrongful lien, potentially, given the documented pattern of communications and the deliberate nature of the enforcement campaign, something that a plaintiff's attorney could argue rose to the level of intentional harassment. Marcus Chen had filed a police report. He had certified mail receipts. He had a paper trail that was, Kellerman now understood, not the defensive scrambling of a man trying to protect himself. It was the methodical construction of a legal record by someone who had known from day one exactly what he owned and exactly what was being done to him. Diane was quiet for a long moment after he finished. Then she said, He should have made this clearer from the beginning. Kellerman closed his eyes. He showed you the deed on the first day, Diane. You told him you'd have your lawyer review it. Another silence. I assumed you had, she said. He did not respond to that. There was nothing to say to it that would be useful. The assumption was the whole problem. The assumption had been the problem from the moment Diane Rothschild had parked her Range Rover in a garage she had never verified she had any right to enter. The assumption had been the problem when the board voted unanimously without examining a single document. The assumption had been the problem when his own office had drafted threatening letters on the basis of a client's description of the situation, rather than the recorded legal reality of it. Institutional certainty. The belief that the HOA controlled everything because it always had. The belief that a man with a deed and a survey and a laminated plat map in his desk drawer was an obstacle to be managed rather than a property owner to be respected. The deed had been sitting in the county recorder's office for 15 years. It had been sitting in Marcus Chen's desk drawer, laminated, waiting. Nobody had read it. That was the whole story. That was the catastrophic, expensive, legally actionable whole of it. Not malice, not conspiracy, just the breathtaking arrogance of people who had stopped checking because they had never needed to check before, who had confused the absence of challenge with the presence of authority. Kellerman told Diane to call an emergency board meeting. He told her to bring every board member who had voted on the enforcement action. He told her to bring her personal liability insurance information. Then he hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of his office, with the deed and the plat and the certified survey spread across his desk, and thinking about a man on a beach in Maui who had known this moment was coming from the very first morning he walked out to find his garage door open and a white Range Rover parked inside it. Marcus Chen had not been building a defense. He had been building a case. The garage doors opened on a Thursday morning, not dramatically. not with ceremony. A man in grey coveralls arrived at 7:15 with an angle grinder and a release order signed by the HOA's attorney, Robert Kellerman, and countersigned by a county property clerk who had reviewed the deed, the survey, and the certified plat map and found them exactly as Marcus Chen had always said they were. The man in coveralls worked for 40 minutes. He ground the welds cleanly, professionally, with the same care that had been used to place them. When he finished, he photographed his work, folded the release order into his breast pocket, and drove away without speaking to anyone. Diane Rothschild watched from across the street. She stood at the edge of her driveway in a fleece vest, holding a coffee mug she had stopped drinking from 20 minutes earlier. Her Range Rover was already back in her own garage. It had been returned 4 days prior, towed at the HOA's expense by a company that had required 3 separate authorizations before agreeing to touch a vehicle sitting on disputed private property. The tow had cost $900. The HOA had paid it from the Community Maintenance Fund. Nobody had voted on that expenditure. Nobody had wanted to. The doors swung open slowly, the way garage doors do when they have been stationary for a long time, with a kind of reluctant gravity, as if the hinges themselves remembered being sealed and weren't entirely sure the sealing was over. The interior was exactly as Marcus had left it. His workbench along the back wall, the pegboard with its tools hanging in outline silhouettes, the oil stain on the concrete floor that he had been meaning to treat for 3 years. Everything in its place. Everything exactly his. Marcus stood in the driveway and looked at it for a long moment. He had landed at LAX the previous evening, taken a rideshare home, and found the neighborhood quiet in the way that suburban neighborhoods are quiet when something has happened that everyone knows about and nobody wants to discuss in the open. His lawn had been maintained. He had arranged that before leaving. His mail had accumulated in a rubber-banded stack that his neighbor Gerald had collected without being asked, leaving it on the porch with a note that said "Only welcome back" in Gerald's cramped handwriting. No explanation. No elaboration. Just those 2 words, which carried more weight than Gerald probably intended. The formal letter from the HOA had been on top of the stack. Marcus had read it standing in his entryway, still carrying his duffel bag. It was 4 paragraphs long and had been drafted, he could tell, by someone who had spent considerable time trying to say a great deal while admitting as little as possible. The phrase administrative misunderstanding appeared twice. The phrase good faith error in jurisdictional assessment appeared once. The word apology appeared in the 3rd paragraph, but flanked so carefully by qualifications that it barely functioned as an apology at all, more like the outline of one, the shape of contrition without its substance, but the lien had been released. That was in the 4th paragraph, stated plainly, with a reference number for the county recorder's office. The fines had been voided. The cease and desist had been formally withdrawn. Robert Kellerman had signed the letter, not Diane. That detail was not lost on Marcus. He had set the letter on his kitchen counter and gone to bed. Now, standing in the morning light, watching the doors complete their slow arc, he thought about the surveyor he had hired, a quiet, precise man named Arthur Voss, who had spent 2 days with his equipment on Marcus's property and produced a document so unambiguous that Kellerman had apparently gone pale reading it. If Voss had confirmed what Marcus already knew. The garage sat 3.2 feet outside the HOA's jurisdictional boundary, as established by the original 1987 subdivision plat. It had always been outside that boundary. The HOA had never had authority over it. Not when Marcus bought the house, not during the 15 years he had lived there, not on the Tuesday morning when Diane had opened the door and parked her vehicle inside, as though the concept of private property were a suggestion she had considered and declined. The property had been his, completely, legally, documentably his. The deed said so. The plat said so. The certified survey said so. The county recorder's office said so. The only entity that had ever suggested otherwise was an HOA operating on institutional assumption, on the inherited certainty that what they believed they controlled, might they controlled, because they had always believed it, and no one had ever made them look closely enough to find out they were wrong. That was the thing that stayed with Marcus, not the anger, which had mostly burned itself out somewhere over the Pacific, not the vindication, which was real, but quieter than he had expected. What stayed was the recognition of how the whole machinery had worked, how Diane had never needed to investigate because she had never imagined investigation was necessary, how Kellerman had sent threatening letters built on a foundation he had never examined, how the board had voted unanimously to support an overreach none of them had bothered to verify, how Janet, who had known him for 15 years, had told him it was just a garage without once asking whether the HOA actually had the right to use it, an institutional certainty, the assumption that the map is the territory, the belief that because something has always been treated a certain way, it must be that way, that the paperwork, if it exists at all, will confirm what everyone already knows, except sometimes the paperwork says something else entirely. He walked into the garage and ran his hand along the workbench. The wood was cool and slightly dusty. He picked up a wrench from its outlined hook on the pegboard, turned it in his hand, and set it back. Everything fit. Everything was where it belonged. Behind him, he heard footsteps on the driveway. He turned. Janet stood at the edge of the garage, hands in her jacket pockets, looking at the floor with the expression of someone who has rehearsed what they want to say and found, in the moment, that the rehearsal wasn't sufficient. I should have asked more questions, she said. Marcus looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said, you should have. She nodded. She didn't offer more, and he didn't ask for it. Some things don't require elaboration. Some acknowledgments are complete in their plainness. After she left, Marcus stood alone in the garage for a while longer. Through the open doors, he could see the street, the quiet houses, the ordinary suburban morning proceeding at its ordinary pace. Somewhere down the block, a sprinkler was running. A dog was barking at something that had probably already moved on. He thought about the laminated plat map in his desk drawer. He thought about the 15 years he had lived in this neighborhood, knowing what he knew, be carrying the documentation the way a careful man carries documentation, not because he expected to need it, but because he understood that the world occasionally requires you to prove what you already know to be true. He had been ready. That was the thing. When the moment came, he had been ready. He reached up and pulled the garage door down slowly, listening to the hinges move, feeling the familiar resistance and release. Then he pulled it back up again, just to feel it working, just to confirm that it still answered to him. It did. It always had.